Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. I have to say that I am humbled standing in front of you for two reasons. One, the quality of our speakers, who I will introduce in a moment, and secondly, because I did such a terrible job last time introducing the speakers that Julie has actually done my script in red, pointing out where I should not be forgetting to make certain comments. Thank you, Julie. I do want to start off by thanking our program committee. Laura Nickel, who will be moderating our session today, is one of our key members of the committee. They do a wonderful job, and without the committee, we would not have the programs that we do have. We are keenly focused on providing quality education programs for directors, and this will be the theme going forward into 2015. You can see, I believe, on this list the programs upcoming. Please also don't forget to attend those meetings that are in Austin, San Antonio, if you're traveling that way. Finally, it is now my pleasure to introduce both of our speakers, Dr. Eagleman, who is with us today, a very, very special treat. Some of you may have read about his background, but let me just add a few comments. Dr. Eagleman holds joint appointments with the Departments of Neuroscience and Psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. His areas of research are perception, vision, help me pronounce the other word, synesthesia, social neuroscience, and the intersection of neuroscience with the legal system. And as such, he directs the Laboratory for Perception and Action, as well as Baylor College of Medicine's initiative on neuroscience and law. Getting to some of the more interesting aspects to his background, he is a very accomplished author, and his book, which is called Some, was translated into an opera. How he got from writing a book to an opera, hopefully we'll find out a little bit more this afternoon. Moderating the fireside chat is, as I mentioned a moment ago, our very own Laura Nickel, who is the founding partner, one of three founding partners of Rio Advisors. She has a very long and illustrious background serving some of our major corporations, in particular Chase and American General, in senior leadership positions, in particular in the area of human resources. She is also a very active board member, serving as chair of the Board of Advisors at Duke Divinity School, chair of the Board of Hope and Healing Institute here in Houston, and a board member of the Fifth Ward Redevelopment Corporation. Please join me in welcoming both Laura Nickel and Dr. Eagleman.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Can I get the slides up, please? Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today for a little while, just a short time, about the foundation of what I do, and then Laura and I will do Q&A. This is what I study in my laboratory. So this is about 3 pounds, and it represents everything that you are. It's your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, the agony, the ecstasy. All of that is in this sort of alien computational material that we're just scratching the surface of right now. Now, how do we know that that is you and not some other part of your body is you? It's because if you were to damage, let's say, your pinky in an accident, you would be sad about that, but you wouldn't be any different as a person. But if you were to damage an equivalently sized chunk of brain tissue, that can change you entirely. So that could change your risk aversion, your personality, your decision-making, your capacity to see colors or name animals, or 100 other things that we see every day when people get even very small amounts of brain damage. And this is how we know that who you are fundamentally rests in this 3 pounds of tissue. Now, the thing that really has interested me for a long time is the absolute size and complexity of this. So a brain is made up of 100 billion specialized cells called neurons, and every single neuron is about as complicated as the city of Houston. So every single neuron in your brain has the entire human genome in it and is trafficking millions of proteins around. And these are connected in such density that each one is connected to about 10,000 others. So what you have are thousands of trillions of connections between these things. So it's a system that bankrupts the language. We don't have any way of even having a hint of a shadow of a notion of something this size and complexity, and yet somehow this is you. And so what I want to talk about today are 2 aspects of this. One is how all of this matters for the way that companies run and the way that consumers think about companies. And the other half that I want to talk about is how board members use their brains to make decisions. And so these are two separate topics that I want to hit both of. So let me just say something that got me to write my last book, because I was so interested in the fact that everything going on about you and your decision making is happening at this level of cells, and it's completely invisible to you. So when I take a drink of water, all I know is whether I got the water to my mouth or not, or whether I spilled it on myself. But in fact, just the simple act of lifting the glass of water is underpinned by a lightning storm of brain activity down at this level. But it's completely invisible to me. I have no idea that all that's happening. And it's not just a glass of water, it's everything in your life. It's recognizing a friend's face, falling in love, driving a car, getting a joke. All of this is underpinned by lightning storms of activity at this level. It's totally invisible to you. And this is what leads to the idea of the unconscious brain. In other words, all the stuff that's happening under the level of conscious awareness. So the conscious you is the part that flickers to life when you wake up in the morning. But that's a broom closet in the mansion of the brain. It's the littlest bit of what's happening. And most of what you think and do and act and believe, you have no access to that. So think about when you have an idea and you say, oh, I just thought of something. Well, it wasn't really you, right? Because your brain's been working on that behind the scenes for hours or days, consolidating information, trying things out, evaluating it. Finally, it serves it up to your conscious mind, and you say, oh, I'm a genius. But it wasn't really you that gets credit for it. And so this is the idea of the unconscious brain. As Carl Jung said about it, in each of us there is another whom we do not know. As Pink Floyd put it, there's someone in my head, but it's not me. So I'll give you a couple quick examples of what the unconscious brain is doing under the hood. There was a study done some years ago where psychologists showed men pictures of women's faces and just asked them to rate the attractiveness of the women in the photograph from 1 to 10. And what the men didn't know is that in half of the photographs, the women's eyes had been dilated, so the pupils were bigger. So it turns out that uniformly, the men rated the women with dilated eyes as more attractive. But the important part is that none of the men noticed, oh, her eyes are a millimeter larger over here. And presumably, none of the men knew that dilated eyes is a biological sign of sexual readiness in women. But their brains knew it. Whoop. And here they were, making the right sorts of decisions without having any access to why. But the why has to do with deeply carved evolutionary programs running under the hood that they didn't even know were steering them. But so much of our life is steered by this sort of unconscious drive. So I'll just give you one example, which is that if you're holding a warm mug of coffee, you'll describe your relationship with your mother as closer than if you're holding an iced coffee. Something as fundamental as your belief about your relationship with your mother is influenced by these unconscious signals coming up to your brain. Okay, so there's this enormous gap between what your brain's doing and what the mind has access to. The mind, you can think about it like the CEO of a giant company. The CEO's job is to sort of have the long-term vision and get the headlines of what's going on, but to be insulated from all the details that are happening in the company, the millions and millions of details that allow it to run. The CEO's job is just to be alerted when something unusual is happening and to sort of navigate into the future. And that's all that the mind ever gets a hold of. And it turns out that there's so much that your brain's doing that you can't access. So just as an example, I'd like everyone to put their hand up on their steering wheel. So go ahead and put your hands up on your steering wheel. Okay, so you're driving 30 miles an hour along Buffalo Speedway. I want you to make a lane change into your right lane. You're in the center lane. I want you to move over to the right lane. So go ahead. Okay. I only saw one guy use his blinker. But it's not, okay, as far as I could see, it's hard to watch everyone at the same time, but as far as I could see, everybody did it wrong. So what I saw everybody do is turn the wheel to the right and then back again. So that just steered you onto the sidewalk. You just crashed into a building. The way that you do a lane change is you turn to the right, back to center, just as far to the left, and back to center again. That's how you do a lane change. And you do it every day, and you have no idea how you do it. Right? Because your brain is doing all sorts of operations that you don't have any access to. And it turns out that often, if you try to figure out what your brain's doing, you'll only mess it up. So one advantage of coming to this holiday party is that that from now on, you'll know if you're ever losing a game of tennis, how to win, which is all you need to do is compliment your opponent on his serve. You say, you serve so well, how exactly do you do that? And as soon as he starts trying to explain how he does it, he's dead. He can't do it anymore. Because when the CEO of the company starts going down into places he doesn't belong, then all bets are off there. And so, in fact, when I was younger, I played baseball, and our coach used to say to us, I want you guys to think out there. And I said, actually, you want us not to think out there. You want us to train a sufficient number of hours that we're totally automatized, and then we just do the right thing. But he never believed me. So I had to write a book about it, which is my book Incognito. So here's the thing for today's purposes, is that most of what's happening with your cognition is running under the hood. You don't know what it's actually doing. And this is the point I needed to get to take this fork now into two things. So first I want to talk about the brain of the consumer who's looking at companies. And then I'm going to, in a few more moments, get over to the brain of the board member. So as far as the consumer brain goes, it's that the unconscious brain is driving all of our decision-making, really. And things like how we respond to brands and companies, who we show loyalty to. And it turns out that if you ask consumers about things about why they prefer one company over another, they'll have a conscious narrative about that. But they don't usually have access to the real reasons why they maintain loyalty to certain companies and brands and not to others. And this is why market research typically falls short. There are many famous examples where you do market research, you find that everyone's going to buy this television, not that television, then you look at what actually happens in the store, and it's just the opposite. Because people don't always know why they do what they do. So I'm curious, how many people have heard of the field of behavioral economics? Okay, great, about a third. Okay, so here's the idea. In classical economics, you assume that everybody's a rational actor and that people can do cost-benefit analyses. But it turns out that's not how brains actually operate. And so that led to this new field called behavioral economics or neuroeconomics, which tries to study how people actually operate and make decisions. So in neoclassical economics, you've got Homo economicus, and he's rational, maximizes gain, minimizes loss, delays gratification, objective, unswayed by feeling, behaves consistently. That's the classical model. But so that means if you offer, let's say, 3 sodas to Homo economicus versus 4, and you're charging $1 for one and $1.50 for the other, that's an easy decision. That's just a math problem, right? And there's always a right answer there. But it turns out that real people aren't quite like that. Homo sapiens, as soon as you put branding on or labels, it changes the equations entirely. It's no longer just a math problem. And so my colleagues and I have been interested in this sort of thing about how people actually make decisions. And it turns out Homo sapiens is more like this: irrational, immediate gratification, ignores consequences, swayed by emotion, behaves inconsistently, confused by risk, and influenced by branding. This is the genesis of neuroeconomics. And so what my colleagues and I have been doing for a while is doing things like measuring what's actually happening in the brain when people are confronted with real-life decisions and how they make their choices. And it turns out, I'll summarize about a decade of data in just one slide here, which is that there are competing networks in the brain when faced with a choice. Some of those networks have to do with things like price point, valuation. Other networks have to do with the emotional experience involved with the choice. And other networks have to do with the social context, what they think about the company, what they think about other people, and their friends' likes, things like that. So it turns out these networks in the brain are always battling it out. And so the right way to think about this thing is with neurobiological conflict in decision making. It's something like this. And so what I'll do quickly is just zoom in on each one of these networks for a minute to give a sense of what's competing when people are making decisions. So let's zoom in on this first one about valuation. So there were some famous behavioral economists, Kahneman and Tversky, and here's one of their examples. So let's say you're in the market to buy a pen. There's a very particular pen that you've wanted, and you find it for $29, and you're just about to purchase it. And suddenly I call you and I say, hey, I'm across the street at Target, and I found that pen that you wanted, and it's $19 over here. So you're holding it in your hand, it's $29 in the store you're standing in. I'm across the street at Target, it's only $19. How many people are going to go buy it at Target? How many people are going to go buy it at Target? Okay, great. It's a rational thing to do. Okay, now let's say scenario 2 is you're in the market for a suit. There's a very particular suit you wanted, and you find it at a store for $569. And I call you, and I say, hey, I just found that suit you wanted. I'm across the way. It's $559 here. So $569 versus $559. So who's going to leave the store and go across the street now? Okay, nobody. Here's the thing. The questions are identical. What I'm asking is $10 worth going across the street for you? It's the same $10. And in the first case, you were willing to drop the pen and go. And in the second case, you're not. But it's really just a question about what your time is worth here. Okay, so it turns out that we don't really know what we like or what we want or how to value things until we understand them in context. And companies often take advantage of this by breaking the context. So we all remember a time when you could drive anywhere and get a cup of coffee for 50 cents. So Starbucks changed those expectations, and they had to unanchor from that so that they set things up like a cafe with art, and they made it with scones, and they made it a whole different experience. So now you pay a whole lot more for a cup of coffee. So how much is a cup of coffee worth? Well, it's whatever the context is set to be. So, McDonald's started taking some pot shots at this a while ago, and they made these signs that said $4 is dumb. And the fact is that Homo economicus knows that's right, and Homo sapiens doesn't care. Because the valuation of how much the cup of coffee is worth is just a matter of the context that's set. Okay, so that's chapter 1 about valuation. Chapter 2 is about this other network, the importance of emotions in decision making. So it turns out that we sometimes think about the brain like an information processing system, but what that leaves out of the picture is the enormous sway that emotions have on the way we make our choices. So here's just an example. If you are in a foul-smelling room, you will make harsher moral decisions. You'll hear stories about other people, other actions that people take, and you'll judge them more harshly, again, because of these unconscious influences where you feel disgust. Okay, let me give you a scenario, a philosophical puzzle that outlines as well, I think. It's called the trolley dilemma. And it's the following. It's that you're standing over here, and you see that there's a trolley whose brakes are broken, and it's barreling down the track out of control, and it's going to kill 5 people who are tied to the track. Now, you happen to see that there's another track where there's only 1 person tied there, and you happen to be standing next to a lever, and so you've got the choice whether to pull the lever to divert the trolley down that track there so that only 1 person will be killed instead of 5 people. So how many people are going to pull the lever so only 1 person is killed instead of 5? I should hope everybody would raise their hand here. Okay, right? It's better to have 1 person die than 5 people die. Okay, now here's another scenario. Okay, so it's the same setup where it's a trolley going down the track out of control, 5 people, they're going to die. But this time, instead of standing near the track, you're standing over the track on a footbridge. And you notice that standing right in front of you is a fat man. And you realize that if you push this man over the edge of the bridge, his body weight will be sufficient to stop the train and save the 5 people. So how many people are going to push the big man? Okay, what I want you to notice is exactly the same problem, which is, would you trade 1 life for 5 lives? The 2 scenarios are identical in their outcome, and yet nobody is willing to push the man. Why? Well, it turns out that when you have to actually think about interacting with somebody and touching them and pushing them to their death as opposed to just pulling a lever, that turns on these networks in your brain that are involved in emotion. So the first scenario is just a math problem to your brain. It's easy. But the second scenario turns on these emotional networks, and it completely changes your decision making. The ancient Greeks had this idea that life is like you're a charioteer, and you're trying to stay down the middle of the road, and you've got the black horse of passion and the white horse of reason, and they're always pulling you in opposite directions, and you've got to deal with both of these things pulling you in different ways, and that's exactly right. It's exactly right. We're very much creatures of our emotion, and so it turns out that this network understands a particular kind of language. It cares about emotional experience. So when it comes to things like companies, This network, which steers our choices, cares about the emotional experience. So all these terms that companies use, like integrated approach and blah, 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 doesn't understand this. Doesn't even get what those terms mean. All it cares about is, don't hate me because I'm beautiful, or are you man enough to eat this burger? That's the kind of thing that stimulates this area about emotional experience. Okay, so that's chapter 2. Brains traditionally have been studied in isolation. That's what neuroscience has always done. But just recently, there's been this realization that a lot of the brain circuitry has to do with other brains. We're a very social species, so a lot of the neurons in my head have to do with the neurons in your head and how we interact and things like trust and integrity and reputation, all kinds of things about interaction. And there's an emerging discovery out of my lab and others, which is that to the brain, companies are just like people. And what I mean by that is all the circuitry we have for dealing with other people and deciding, do I trust that person, do I like that person, and so on, that's the exact same circuitry that we use to judge the companies that we interact with. Why? Because in evolutionary time, we didn't have time to evolve something new to deal with Google or Exxon or things like that. This is it. All we have is the ability to judge them like people. In fact, we just published a paper on this. My lab just published a paper called Are Corporations People Too? From a neural point of view, the neural correlates are indistinguishable when you're thinking about the moral actions of a person versus a corporation. Okay, I'll give you an example of this. Nike tied themselves to Tiger Woods, and what I thought was interesting is watching their stock price on the day that his infidelity was put out on Twitter, and their stock fell that day, and it continued to fall for the next 6 months. Because, I mean, why should Nike's stock have anything to do with his infidelities? Well, it's simply because it's impossible for people to separate these things out. When we think about trust and integrity and reputation, those are all tied together, the person, the face, the company. I used to ask some of my students which of these companies they would rather work for, and everyone used to say BP back in the day. And I'd say, oh, why? And they'd say, well, it's because it's a green company. And I'd say, no, it's a petroleum company. And they'd say, no, it's a green company. And then after the Gulf spill, now no one would ever want to work for BP. And it's just an interesting thing to observe the way that we come to view companies as sort of friends or not trusted. And so in the era of the internet especially, what happens is things like breaches of trust by corporations travel quickly, and you can't erase them. So here's just an example. Does anyone remember this guy, Dave Cullen? He was traveling on United Airlines, and he watched from the window as they picked up his guitar case and tossed it, and it got bounced around, and we got off the plane. His guitar was broken. So he called United and told them and asked them to replace the guitar, and they wouldn't. And so he got mad about it, and he wrote a song called United Breaks Guitars, and then it went viral on YouTube. And so then The Economist published an article. They didn't estimate that it was something like $180 million was the cost to United Airlines from this breach of trust because the YouTube video went viral. And so what this means is, in traditional economics, everything's treated as a short-term market exchange. But I think the lesson from neuroeconomics is that customers need to be treated like friends. And what that means is that it's issues of trust and like and all the things that people look for in their friends and neighbors and colleagues, that's the same thing they're looking for in companies. And in fact, I think an interesting side note is that when these social media platforms first came out, every company was thinking, great, how do we sell on these? And what they all discovered is you can't really sell on those. But it's not about that. It's about establishing friends. It's about chatting. It's about, it's about branding only. It's not about selling directly on these. I just was looking at this. Burger King has, like 6.7 million. Like, what sober adult is saying, oh, I like Burger King the way I like a friend? But people do. And what Burger King does then is they don't try to sell you stuff. All they do is they say, you like us? We love you. We hope you're having a great day. It's just chatty. It's just like having a friend. Okay, so the idea is that people's brains are wired to understand institutions exactly the way that they're wired to understand people. Okay, so the summary of this first part is that, the way that people make decisions about brand loyalty and companies and so on, it has to do with these three axes, and they're always battling it out under the surface. And so questions that companies need to ask themselves often is, how are they maintaining valuation? How are they speaking to emotions? And how are they cultivating a sense of social connection? Okay, so that's the first part of what I want to tell you about, is how brains have to do with how people see companies. And now the second part is the brain of the board member, which I think is an interesting idea to talk about. And so here's the thing. I told you about this thing with steering, with tennis, and so on. Brains are really good at automatized behavior. That's what they're really specialized in. And the question I think that's important for boards is to figure out how to move beyond automatized behavior. And I mean this both for individuals as well as boards and the behavior of the company. It's so easy to get into routines and patterns. And the question that I'm going to address now is, how do we move past that? Because the really important part for thriving in an innovation economy has to do with the opposite of automatized behavior, which is cognitive flexibility. And this is the ability to see things in a new way and have novelty in what you're generating as an individual and as a company. So, to explain this, I want to start with a quick example here, which is, I want you to think for a moment, just imagine standing on a beach at sunset. So just imagine that for a moment. Okay, so how many of you pictured the white foam tips on the waves? Okay. How many of you pictured a little crescent moon in the sky? How many of you pictured some birds wheeling in the air? How about some coconut husks on the beach? Okay, so it's pretty impoverished, right? Almost nobody raised their hand. So why? Well, I'll tell you why. Here's the thing. Neurons work by association. So neurons are these specialized cell types, and they're connected to others. And the secret of the brain is that everything is connected to everything else in a vast network of association. So, for example, when I'm walking down the hall and I smell coffee, that's associated with the taste of coffee and how coffee feels on my hand and how it'll feel on my tongue and how it'll make me feel. And all these things are tied together in an associative neural network. That's how everything's stored. So if we zoom in on that, if I asked you to think of rabbit, for example, that is associated physically, it's tied in with everything else that you've ever thought about a rabbit. I mean, everything that you know about rabbits is all tied in with that in that network. Okay, so the question is this. Given these florid networks in your brain, why is it that when I asked you to imagine standing on a beach at sunset, all of that went away and you went straight from beach to water? What happened to the rest of it? What happened is this. It turns out that the brain is really good at following the path of least resistance. And it's always going to take the shortcut if allowed. And this is because the unconscious brain is ruthlessly efficient. So in our ancestors, in our history, if you were hungry, you go out and you find food. You don't dance or paint or do something else. You go and you solve the problem. And that's why we have this path of least resistance that we're so good at going down. But the question is, how do we get back into that network? How do we dig out something that's a little more creative? So here's the good news. The good news is that the brain is not hardware, and it's not really thought of as software. It's what I call liveware. And what that means is, technically, it's called brain plasticity. And this is the topic of my next book, called Live Wired, is about how the human brain is flexible and always building new roadways. So let me give you an example of this. It turns out that this is what a slice of a healthy human brain looks like. This is what advanced Alzheimer's looks like. Some of you may know about these studies that are ongoing with nuns in New York, where these nuns live in a convent and they interact, they have a nice life together, and when they die, they've all agreed to donate their brains. And what's come out of this study so far is that about a third of the nuns, it turns out, had Alzheimer's. Their brains were degenerating and actually looked like that, but nobody knew it when they were alive. Why? Because they had such active social lives and they were doing stuff and keeping cognitively fit, and as a result, they were building new roadways, and nobody could tell that their brain tissue was actually degenerating because they were building new roads, and so even as some of the highways dropped out, they were able to get from point A to point B. And so it turns out, challenging yourself to behave, to think in new ways, actually creates new roadways. So what that means is creative thinking, cognitive flexibility is a habit that can be established and can get back in these networks and open them up. So the idea is when the unconscious brain serves something up, you got to send it back. So whatever the first thing is that comes up probably isn't the best answer. It's the path of least resistance, and you have to dig a little deeper into those networks. This is actually quite an old idea that Leonardo da Vinci practiced. He got in the habit of questioning everything in the outside world, but also questioning everything in the inside world. So he never trusted his first answer to something. Whatever came up first, he always rejected it and sent it back. And that's a very smart strategy. So the way that this actually can be implemented in people's lives and companies is, for example, with idea quotas. So this is Thomas Edison, and he always implemented idea quotas, which is something that I implement in my lab. So I don't ever tell my students, hey, come back with a solution to this problem. I tell them, come back with 7 solutions to this problem. And they have to come back with that many solutions because the first ones probably aren't as rich as the successive ones. And so what this encourages generally is productivity, not reproductivity. Okay, so the idea is never accept the first answer. And I think this is really important because we all know that we've gone from a manufacturing economy to an information economy, but I don't think it ends there. As our machines are getting better at collecting and digesting and processing information, I think we're pretty much at the tail end of this, and we're moving into a creativity economy, where the winners in the next generation will be those who are cognitively flexible and thinking of new ways of doing things. And so, how do you actually implement this in a company? Well, it turns out that's not easy. That's the challenge. And so, I'm just going to give you one example of a way that it's doable in a workplace or in a boardroom, which I think is interesting. And I'm just curious how many people have heard of the 6 hats method of thinking? How many people have heard of this? Okay, only a few. I'm really glad I'm mentioning it then, because I think this is a very valuable way for everybody to shake themselves out of particular patterns of thinking, both at the individual level and at the board level, which is the following. So let's say you have 6 people around the table, but this can be done with more. But 6 people around the table, everybody wears a hat of a different color. It's not actually a physical hat. You're pretending to wear this hat, and you play a different role. So the guy in the white hat, it's all about the facts, just the facts. That's the only thing he or she can discuss. The person in the red hat, it's just how it feels. Does this feel good to me? Does this idea feel bad to me? Person in the black hat, only job is to criticize, is to say what's wrong with it, why it won't work, whatever is being discussed on the table. The yellow person, all about the positive. Hey, this is why this is a great idea. The person in the green hat, it's all about creative thinking. Their job is only come up with wacky new ideas. The wackier the better, without any reference to whether it's financially feasible, to whether it's a good idea, doesn't matter at all. And the blue hat oversees the process and tries to summarize what's happening. But the idea is this. You do that with whatever issue is being grappled with. Everyone wears their hat and plays their role. And you do that for a little while, and then you switch hats, and you take a different role. You're forced into a different perspective, and you can only argue from that perspective. And this has been proven to be a really useful way for groups of people to be able to really come at things with a fresh perspective and dig deeper and get at things that they weren't able to before. So, just to summarize this, the unconscious brain is what's driving decision-making. It's always going to take the path of least resistance, and our job as individuals and as board members is to shake ourselves off that path. And that includes things like challenging ourselves to new tasks, rejecting the first answer, implementing idea quotas, and shaking things up wherever possible, including even basic things like every time you have a board meeting, always switch the seats around. Don't sit in the same positions with relation to one another. Always switch up the room, switch up your seating positions. Okay, so I think that's all I'm going to say. I would just challenge you to, when you think about, when you leave here today, think about how you can see issues in a new way, how you can avoid dogma, how you can celebrate possibility. That's all I'm going to say, and I'm going to invite Laura up here to join me, and we'll do Q&A from here. Thanks very much.
There's lots of information that you just gave us, and I know that people are thinking of questions. If you'll write them down and just raise them up, they'll get brought up to me and we can ask. It's interesting when you talk about board members switching seats to get them out of a pattern. I'm wondering about even selecting board members. Is there what you know about the brain and different ways of making decisions? Is there something that a chairman should think about or a board should think about as they're selecting others?
I think part of it, for me, what I would look for is people who are really eager and excited when they get new facts that disconfirm their framework. So what we all naturally do is look for things that support our own biases. But some people get really excited when they hear something that's loaded for them. And by loaded, I mean it shakes up all of what they believed was true. That's the kind of person you want.
There's a lot of times when people talk about making a decision, especially important decisions, and they say, I've got to trust my gut, what my intuition is. How do you factor in intuition in making decisions, especially big strategic decisions?
Yeah, what we call intuition is really a sort of the behind-the-scenes summary that the brain is doing that we don't have access to all the details of. And the fact is that sometimes intuition steers us in the right direction, but not always. So I think it depends on the kind of decision to be made. So, I mean, I'll just give an example of this, which is, take something like xenophobia, fear of foreigners. This is something that sadly seems to be built into humans, that we've got in-groups and out-groups and so on. People get intuitions about that. Well, I don't want to sell my house to that person. But in fact, that's such a bad idea that we've legislated against it. We don't even allow that. So I only mention this to say that intuition isn't always a good judge of what should be done. Nonetheless, when there's a decision that involves lots of parameters and it's way too big for you to really wrap your head around all the details, intuition there is probably the best judge that you'll have in the end. Just marinating on it and thinking in the end, wow, something about this doesn't feel quite right to me. It's your brain's way of summarizing lots of data.
That's interesting. One of the things I think that is so interesting about what you've done with your research is begin to translate it into products that can be used. And it would be helpful, I think, to tell the audience a little bit about brain check and cognitive regeneration.
Okay.
Or degeneration.
Yeah. Well, so I have a company called BrainCheck, which uses mobile tablets to detect concussion at the sidelines of athletic games, because in 5 minutes, by doing exactly the right tests, essentially little games, I can measure 12 different aspects of what's happening under the hood. I can measure the aspects of brain function, all of which get hurt when you've hit your head. So things about reaction time, balance, cognition, perception, executive function, things that clearly take a hit when your brain has taken a hit. So very quickly I can detect these things, and then I've used this same method of quick tests on an iPad to look for things like mild cognitive impairment. So for people who are, let's say, retired, and they just want to keep a baseline on how they're doing cognitively to see if something is changing, this is a way of doing it, because all the elements that show up when someone has mild cognitive impairment, that's what I test for on this. I'm also using this to test for impairment while driving. So so this is an example that I've really enjoyed taking out of the lab, because this is an area I've got a lot of experience in, is how to design these tests to understand what's happening in there. And this allows me to have some sort of real-world impact with it, where the rubber can hit the road.
I think it's interesting, too, because it really takes the ideas that you're using and applies them. It means so much change is ahead of us, I think. As we think about boards and companies evolving, we plan for the future. I wonder how we should begin thinking about testing brains and testing cognition.
Right. You mean testing cognition of board members?
Right.
Oh, boy. This is an interesting one, because I was just speaking to some federal judges, and it turns out that at the circuit level, they don't have to retire. They get to choose when they retire, and some of them start having cognitive decline, and they know it, but they don't want anyone else to know it. Does anyone watch the television show Perception on TNT? Does anyone watch that show? Okay, not all at once now. Okay, fine. So it turns out I wrote an episode of Perception based on this issue about about a man who's cognitively declining and didn't want anyone else to know it. So he set up the login on his computer where he could only log in if he was able to pass a series of tests. And the day that he couldn't pass those tests, it kills him, it blows up. So, yeah, I'm not recommending that for boards, but it was an interesting piece of fiction.
But are there exercises you can do to keep your cognition?
Yeah. So it turns out cognitive fitness is really important. It's exactly as important as physical fitness, going to the gym, this sort of thing. And there's a lot of detailed debate about whether you can actually reverse neurodegeneration, things like that. The answer seems to be no, but you can certainly slow down degeneration by keeping cognitively fit. So for example, with the nuns, even though they had the molecular markers of Alzheimer's that was killing their brain cells, they were doing just fine because they were in a social community, they were interacting every day, they had responsibilities, they were doing lots of things. So things like brain games on phones and stuff, that's a start, but even better than that is having a really active social life and challenging yourself to novelty and injecting novelty at every turn. If anyone's interested in doing that, by the way, if anyone's wearing a watch, a really good idea is just to take off your watch and put it on your other hand. And all day long, it'll shake you up a little bit. It'll shake you off the path of least resistance. It's very useful to do this sort of thing. When you go home tonight, brush your teeth with your other hand. One thing I do, which drives my wife crazy sometimes, is I try to drive a different route home from work every day. Because otherwise you lose your life. Otherwise you become on autopilot, and every day you drive to and from work the same way, and it's like no time has passed. It's compressed because you're essentially completely unconscious the whole drive. So the key is, this won't make you live longer, but it'll make you feel like you've lived longer.
Here are a few questions from our audience. What is favorable and unfavorable about the context of a meeting as a means for decision making?
I think that meetings can be favorable if done correctly. So I think the six hats thinking method is probably the best approach I know of certainly, to making sure that instead of it just being where everyone gets to argue their own thing, and we've all been in meetings where there's egos involved and other incentive structures, but if you're in a particular position where you're supposed to argue just from one point of view, like here's financially why it does not make sense, or here's why this is a great idea irrespective of finance, or whatever it is, and then you switch roles, that's a really useful way to get something out of a meeting. I think everybody should try that and then and see what your results are.
I was just at a corporate board meeting in Denver, and as the activity in the afternoon, they had us paint together. Are there activities like that would create a disruption in patterns? We each had our own canvas. We had to judge our paintings. It was really interesting.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I can imagine. So, I mean, it would certainly lighten the mood and make people feel more open and happy to chat with one another instead of feeling like I'm going to sit at this meeting and sneak a text message in or something. I don't know about the painting in particular, but any of these bonding things seem to be useful.
The question is, to the extent that we gain wisdom with age, does this or should this weigh heavily against age-limited terms for board members?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the person, because I know people who are in their 80s. We all know people like this who love to be disrupted, who love to hear an idea that shakes their foundations, and they seek that out, and that's a great person to have, because that's a person with wisdom who's not entrenched or ossified, and those people are invaluable. So mandating an age limit or a term length might not always be a good idea. There should be some other excuse to get rid of somebody once they've become too entrenched, other than just predicated on age.
It's about breaking patterns over and over again, is what you're saying. It's really popping it up to the consciousness. How is researching via the internet affecting our cognitive abilities?
I think it's terrific, actually, what's happening with the net, and the reason is, for brain plasticity to happen, you have to have the right neurotransmitters there. You have to have the right chemical cocktail. And that happens to correlate with engagement and curiosity. So the ancient Greeks had noted that there were 7 different levels of learning, and the highest level of learning is when you're curious about something. And it turns out that when used correctly, what the internet's wonderful for is the answers that you learn are in context with the question you're asking. In other words, I want to know how to do X, and there's the answer, poof, and it really sticks. So all of us were educated in a school system that was just in case education. So just in case you need to know this list of dates in Mongolian history, we're going to tell you. But what this next generation has is the opportunity for just-in-time learning, where as soon as you need to know how to fix a flat tire or understand partial differential equations or whatever it is, you look it up and you learn it. And it's I think the next generation is going to be so much smarter than we are. I run into 14-year-old kids all the time who say something that's so smart. And I say, how did you know that? Where did you learn that? They say, oh, I learned it from a TED Talk. And it's this sort of intellectual mother's milk that we didn't have at that age. You know, we all had Encyclopedia Britannica where you go and you look something up, and it was static and unchanging. And so in general, I'm quite sanguine on the opportunities afforded by the net.
Along the same line, what do you think about the luminosity drills?
So Luminosity is this cognitive fitness game. Some of you might be signed up with. I think it's good stuff. It's like going to the gym. As I said a moment ago, probably if you have an active social life, that's even better. But this is certainly better than nothing. I mean, playing these brain games to just challenge yourself and keep active, it's great. There's all this sort of detailed academic debate about whether that shows transference to other tasks of daily living. The jury's still out on this stuff, but it's certainly better than the other options people have, like watching Jerry Springer or whatever it is they would be doing.
You might be dating yourself there, huh? Why does your reaction time slow down with age?
You know, I don't know, and I have some hypotheses about that would be for another time, but I ask all my clinical colleagues this. I say, hey, why do people fall down when they get older? And they say, well, it's a balance thing. I say, I think it's actually a timing thing. So as you get older, it takes longer to send signals from your head down to your toe and get the feedback and coordinate accordingly. And I think that's why people start having balance problems. But time is something that's completely missing from the clinical landscape currently. So maybe we could unpack that further at a different time, but that's, yeah.
What do you think about neurofeedback for behavior modification?
I think the idea is very promising. You know, versions of biofeedback have been around since the 60s and 70s, where you hook an electrode to your skin and you're looking at your galvanic skin response and you try to modulate your stress or you modulate your heartbeat, things like that. Those are on the right track, but the technologies are still really crude. One of the things we're doing in my laboratory right now is working on a way of helping people, of having a rehabilitative strategy for crack cocaine addiction. And we're using brain imaging. It's called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, where we're actually looking inside people's heads at very high detail and using that for neurofeedback. So we take people who are addicted to crack cocaine, who want to quit, but they've been unable, which is most addicts. We show them pictures of cocaine. That lights up these craving networks in their brain. Then we ask them to suppress their craving by thinking about all the costs this has had to them. That lights up other networks in their brain. So let's call this the craving network and the suppression network. And then we give them visual feedback on how these two networks are doing in relation to one another. And we train them how to make the suppression network have more activity than the craving network. And they practice this over and over. I call this the prefrontal gym, because they're practicing how to train their brain to squelch their craving over and over. And we're just at the foot of the mountain on this, but if this works, it's going to be a game changer, because it can completely change what's happening in the legal system, because currently, you know, our incarceration, our prison population has quadrupled since Nixon announced the war on drugs, because we just take people who are addicted and we put them in jail, which has very low utility and high cost. And so if we actually want to solve the problem, we need to be looking at the brain of the addict, which is something we understand quite well at this point. And that's what we're using neurofeedback to do as far as behavioral modification. So we have pretty high hopes for that.
It might be interesting to talk to the audience just a little bit about some of the experiments you've done at your lab, and these are on the net if you want to look at them, about time perception, and then it ties to this next question about the brain.
Okay. Well, very briefly, I've always been very interested in time, because when I was a kid, I fell off of the roof of a house under construction, and it seemed to take a very long time, and I was thinking about Alice in Wonderland as I was falling, thinking about how this must have been what it was like for her when she fell down the rabbit hole. And I landed and I broke my nose very badly and so on. But when I got a little older and I took physics, I calculated how long the fall took, and it was 0.8 of a second. And I thought, how did it seem to take so long when physically it was such a short fall? So I got really interested in how time seems to warp in scary situations. But it turns out no one had ever done a test on this before, for obvious reasons, because you can't stick somebody in a life-threatening situation. But I figured out how to do it. And so I ended up designing an experiment, which I ran, where I dropped people from a 150-foot tall tower in free fall. And they fell backwards, and they're caught in a net below going 70 miles an hour. And on the way down, it's a 3-second experiment. On the way down, they're looking at this device that I developed and patented that I strapped to their wrist, that's flashing information at them in such a way that I can tell if they're actually seeing in slow motion, like Neo in The Matrix, or whether instead it's a trick of memory and it just seems retrospectively to have taken longer. And it turns out what we discovered, we ran this on 23 volunteers, and it turns out that it's a trick of memory. You can't actually see in slow motion, it's just that you lay down memory in such density when things are scary that when you read that memory back out, as in, what just happened, what just happened, what just happened, you're not used to that kind of density, and so your brain's only interpretation is that it took a really long time. And so that led us to understand lots of things, including why time seems to speed up when you get older. It's because time is all about memory, and so when you're a kid and you get to the end of a childhood summer, you look back and you've got all this footage from the summer, all these novel patterns that you learn. But as you get older and you get to the end of a summertime, you've kind of seen it all before. You've seen all those patterns and so on. And so you think, oh my gosh, it was just winter. So this is, again, why we need to inject novelty. This is why I drive a different route home from work every day. Because we need to find new ways of laying down footage so that we don't get just stuck in our autopilot.
How does the brain differ when reacting to a crisis, and particularly thinking about a crisis for a company or... So I'm just thinking about how time and memory might be different in a time of crisis.
Yeah, well, so what happens is there's a particular sort of emergency control center in your brain called the amygdala. And when you're really in a crisis, that comes online and focuses all your attention to the issue at hand. So if a bear comes in the room, I'm not going to be rounding out my grocery list. I'm going to be trying to find an exit somewhere. So that's what the amygdala is really good for. But, that navigates our decision-making towards certain kinds of decisions. So if you are running from a bear, it's great that you have it. If you're making a boardroom decision and there's just a really scary situation for the company going on, it's not necessarily the case that people are going to be at their best decision-making, because often good decision-making requires a certain level of calm.
In what situations or conditions do the decision axes become skewed? The 3 axes that you were talking about can become skewed, and how can people recognize this and try and become more balanced?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's 2 ways to look at it. One is from the consumer point of view. For different companies, they have to worry about which of those 3 axes they're really hitting, and some companies can be successful just hitting on one of those axes, as in, we're making the cheapest product, and everyone hates it, and no one has a good emotional experience, but valuation's so good that everyone's going to buy it. Other companies say, look, we're charging more, but it's such a good experience, everyone's going to pay more. And other companies worry about, just the social context of it, and they make themselves cool. Like Tom's Shoes or something, they do all this social charity, and so as a result, they get a lot of bonus on this axis about social context. And so anyway, different companies can try to just make sure they're throwing their net wide and hitting all of them. As far as individuals balancing some more than others, it's sometimes suggested that, for example, teenagers care more about the social context piece, about what their friends think and so on. I'm not sure that's true. I see a lot of adults buying a lot of products and fancy cars and homes and stuff for the same reasons of social, just making sure that their friends see them in a certain light. So, anyway.
If corporations are like people, are governments and entire cultures or religious sectors also viewed like people?
Exactly right. And it's because we evolved in small groups and we were able to think about other people. That's what our brains are really wired up to do. But our brains just were never built to think about huge collections of people, whether that collection is a corporation, a religious group, a government. It's all the same. We have no way to look at them except to say, oh, I don't like, I trust, I don't trust, I'm suspicious, I'm not, that kind of stuff. It's all the same mechanisms that get used. When we went hunting there with the best technology that we have to see the difference between the way that you make judgments about people and corporations, we couldn't find any difference in the brain.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Why do some people get locked into a way of thinking despite contrary evidence? And why are some people better at handling complexity than others?
I don't know why some people are better. There's, along any axis that we measure human brains, we find that there's a spectrum of talents. So whether that's, empathy, aggression, skill at swimming, skill at chess, anything we measure, we find some people are better than others. So I don't know why, but it seems like those are the people that you want. And what frustrates me about watching politics all the time is this avoidance of complexity. And instead, it's this, it's the punditry on both sides of saying, well, look, what the American people want is, and then, some simplistic statement, and they get rousing applause for saying something so clear and straight, but in fact, it's moronic because all the complexity has been washed out.
David, looks like we're going to be taken
Oh,
off
we're
the
getting,
stage.
okay. Okay.
Whether it's the audit committee,
I hate
Great.
to stop this,
or
but
the
let's thank
nominating
Laura
committee,
and Dr.
through their
Ellis.
various meetings.